From WisPolitics in Madison, you're listening to Capital Chats.
Hello, everybody. This is Kate Morton with Wis Politics here with the Capital Chats podcast brought to you by Spectrum. Today I'm sharing an interview with Marquette Law School poll director Charles Franklin. We spoke a little bit about the most recent poll results on the state Supreme Court race, as well as how Wisconsinites are feeling about property taxes and school funding. Here's what he had to say. Well, thank you, Charles, for joining me on Capital Chats today. I think to get into things, let's talk a little bit about this state Supreme Court race that we have coming up. It's race between Chris Taylor and Maria Lazar. It hasn't drawn as much attention and spending than when, Janet Protasewicz ran in 23 or when Susan Crawford ran last year. So I'm wondering to start us off, why are voters less tuned into these races? And is it just because of less money going into those campaigns?
Yeah. Well, it is hugely less attention being paid to it than there was last year. The most starkest example of that is that in our poll, we ask, how much have you read or heard about the race? And 12% say they've heard a lot about this year's court race. But last year in February, it was 39% that had heard a lot. So I think that's just a stark difference, three times as much attention last year as this year. Um, I think the money has to be a big part of that. If you're not someone glued to politics,
Mhm.
somebody like us that looks up what's happening and follows what's happening all the time, one of the ways you learn that there's a race is your favorite TV program is interrupted by a campaign commercial. And there's just been so much less of that this year than in the previous two races, actually. Um, Also, maybe there's door knocking going on, but again, that sort of personal contact was a very big part of last year's campaign, and by all evidence, there's far less of that this year. I guess the last point, and maybe it's connected to the lack of spending in the race, is that the majority control of the court is not really up for grabs this time. It's a 4-3 liberal majority, and with a retiring conservative justice, it can only stay 4-3 if the conservative Lazar wins, and it could go up to a 5-2 majority if the liberal Taylor wins. And so, unlike last year when the majority really was up for grabs in that race, this year, I think especially for the folks that donate huge amounts of money to campaigns, it's just not the same stakes as it was a year ago.
Sure. Now, conservative candidates have had a bit of a losing streak in these races in recent years. I'm wondering, why do you think that is, and what are the biggest challenges for them in order to reverse that trend?
I think there are two parts to it. One is the way voters are behaving, and the other is the way candidates are campaigning. Excuse me. Um, the biggest change in voters is that from 2000 until about 2012 or 14, low turnout spring elections really favored Republicans and conservative candidates. During that period, conservatives dominated the court elections the way Democrats have dominated them for the last 7 years or so. Um, and that's a big change. We've seen Democratic turnout rise in the spring elections. We've seen Republicans who are mobilized to vote when Donald Trump is on the ballot stay home in substantial numbers in both midterm elections and especially in spring elections in April. And so, in one way, that's outside the candidate's control. This change in the way voters behave, it is connected to Trump mobilizing less regular voters in his races, while Democrats have reacted to the Trump era generally by substantially boosting their turnout in all elections. So that's the voter side of the question about how the makeup of the electorate now favors liberal or Democratic candidates more than it did in the past.
Mm.
Um, and that's paid off for Democrats in the winning four of the last five Supreme Court races. Um, the thing about candidates is a different matter, and that is that we've seen Supreme Court candidates, primarily on the liberal side, being much more willing to base their campaigns on talking about their values, the things they support, um, not saying how they will vote in particular decisions before them, but saying that, I've stood up for women's rights or for abortion rights, short of mentioning a case,
Mm.
nevertheless, being very explicit about where they stand on some of the issues that face the court or voting rights, for example, now. Conservative candidates over the last several cycles have been much less willing to talk about their conservative values and how those conservative values would affect how they see issues coming before the court. And again, this is multiple candidates, not just the current campaign. Um, a lot of emphasis on I'm just going to interpret the law. We're against judge-made law or legislating from the bench.
Yeah.
And those are consistent with those conservative values, but they maybe don't carry the same message to voters on the conservative side about why this person is someone I should support. So I think we've only seen a few cycles where this has been a big difference between the candidates. But going forward, I do think it raises the question of how can conservative candidates effectively campaign for the Supreme Court without sounding a lot like Democrats in terms of talking about what their values, what their views are, and how that affects issues that may be relevant for the court, if not cases that are actually before the court.
Yeah, it'll be interesting if there's a switch in approach there. Um, I also wanted to talk a little bit about, the latest poll results showed Dems were more likely to vote in this election and to be enthusiastic about it, which is, a big boon for Chris Taylor. How significant a factor is that in the outcome of these races? And why do you think Dems are more enthusiastic or more
Yeah.
likely to vote?
I think it is important, and I think it goes to that point I made a minute ago about how Democrats are more likely to turn out now, whereas in the beginning of the 2000s, it was Republicans more likely to turn out. Um, I think that you see it in our data in that Democrats both say they're more likely to turn out. They say they're more enthusiastic about voting in the race. They say the race is more important to them. Um, and they also, to a much smaller degree, say they follow politics more. So, all four of those possible measures of involvement show a Democratic advantage right now. And that's an advantage that doesn't necessarily show up in presidential fall elections, for example. Um, I think the motivation is twofold. One is it's a reaction to President Trump and the era of President Trump since 2016, in which Democrats are stunningly united in their disapproval of Trump, in their antipathy to Trump. And he turns out to be the great motivator for Democrats. I joked to a Democratic group the other day that they should hope for a third Trump term because it's really what turns out the Democratic votes. Um, but it is a really important effect of the current political era that does help Democrats mobilize in ways that in the past they didn't mobilize to the same degree under previous Republican presidents. Um, I think that just plays a big role in this turnout advantage. And it also means that we don't know what turnout will end up being in the April election. It seems hard to believe it hits the 61% of registered voters that we saw last year, or the just over 50% that we saw earlier in the Protasewicz race. But just because of the data we see in terms of involvement in the campaign, the amount of advertising and door knocking. But I don't know how far down that turnout goes. Um, we've had relatively high turnout in most of our recent court elections, certainly compared to the turnout we saw between 2000 and 2010 or so. Um, so I'm not sure how low it goes. But this is where Democrats do have an advantage because they're more interested, involved, and committed to voting. If turnout does fall into the 40% range, say, instead of the 50% or 60% range, that greater Democratic involvement probably runs up the Democratic vote in the election. So lower turnout probably makes Taylor's margin get bigger rather than get smaller.
Hmm.
And again, goes against the old adage that was, you know, low turnout favors Republicans, high turnout favors Democrats. It seems to be the opposite in elections over the last 10 years.
Yeah, okay. Another topic in this poll was, property taxes, which have become an issue at the state level that's being discussed quite a bit. Voters said they were more concerned about property taxes than funding for K-12 schools. 48% said they would vote for a referendum to increase taxes for schools. 51% said they would vote against one. So has opposition to referendums raising property taxes changed over time, and why do you think that is?
Yes, it certainly has changed over time. If we go way back to 2012 or so, when we first started the Marquette Law School poll, it was fairly evenly balanced, but there were a little bit more saying property taxes was more important than schools. But then in the aftermath of Governor Walker's Act 10 and the first round of school budgets after Governor Walker took office, we saw concern for school spending go up considerably. By 2015, it was a substantial majority that said schools were more important and property taxes had fallen into the low 40% range. That stayed that way until about 2018 when it began to turn around, and concern for property taxes slowly has increased in every one of our polls since 2018. Around 2021 or so, for the first time, we saw more people saying property taxes were more important than schools. And that's just gotten more and more so that now it's in the high 50s or even hit 60% in our February poll. It's about 59 or 58% this time saying property taxes are more important. So that's a huge change. We've asked that question like 26 times over the years. And so we have really one of the best tracks of how opinion has changed. Not all that rapidly, but very steadily and over a long period of time. We haven't asked about the referendum vote as often, but in February, for the first time, we saw more people saying they would vote against a referendum rather than for it. This time, it's a little bit tighter margin between those two, but still slightly more people saying vote against. And in an analysis of referendum passage rates, what percentage of referenda pass for schools, as we've seen the support for K-12 spending come down, in almost perfect parallel with that, the passage rate for referenda has also been coming down. Now, most referenda do still pass, but they're passing at substantially lower rates than they were in 2015 to 2018 or 2020 or so.
Yeah, do you expect the number of referenda passing to continue to go down? There's a lot of them on I can't remember the exact number, but there's several on the April
Yeah.
7th ballot as well.
Well, I think if you follow the record of this declining support for school spending in our poll and how that is tracks well with the declining referenda passage rate, then yes, I would expect that passage rate to inch down some. I don't think it's going to collapse, but
Hmm.
to continue to be more of a problem. We ask about property taxes in two or three other ways, and I think what you see over most of them is that property taxes are a concern. People want some kind of property tax relief. Um, They differ on exactly how that relief should come, whether it should come in a check, a one-time check to offset property taxes, or as some school supporters say, the way to hold down property taxes is for the state to give higher state aids to the school districts so that they're not as reliant on property taxes. And that's an ongoing debate between the parties and between school supporters and those that care more about the property tax itself. I think those issues are unlikely to go away, and it's at this point unclear whether the governor and the legislature will agree to come back for a special session to deal with property taxes. But it is clear that this is something that is high enough on people's concerns that it's an issue for now between Governor Evers and the legislature, but it's almost certainly going to be an issue in the fall campaign for governor as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely something we'll be watching. I think that's all we have time for today, but thank you again, Charles, for coming on Capital Chats.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, if you would like to learn more about the upcoming state Supreme Court race, you can head to our website at wispolitics.com. In the meantime, I'm Kate Morton. Thanks for listening to WisPolitics Capital Chats, brought to you by Spectrum.